We're going to resume now. I'll have to call upon Mr. Allen to lower his voice. I'm in the unenviable position of introducing myself, which I've already done. But I'll repeat that my name is Patricia Zell. I had the honor of working with Senator Inouye for 25 years on the Senate Indian Affairs Committee. And so I was most fortunate and blessed to be at the point in time before the inception of this museum and to be able to come today together with you to share a relatively little known story about this museum and its origins. I will be followed by Kevin Gover, who will be taking up the looking to the future part of our presentation. On November 21st, 1986, Senator Inouye was informed by the leadership of the Senate that he would be designated, if he accepted the assignment, as the chairman of the Senate Indian Affairs Committee. The committee was a very small committee in terms of numbers of members. It started out at a low point. It had 5 members, 5 senators. After Senator Inouye had served on the committee for a number of years, he was not only embraced by Indian country, but working together, things started to change, and members of the Senate recognized that Indian country was no longer a place where energies and efforts would be put and pitted against hopeless causes. And at the high point of all the work that Indian country was doing with the senator, 20 senators, 1/5 of all members of the United States Senate, asked, no one came to them and said, would you please serve on the Indian Affairs Committee, which was the way things were defined. In earlier times, 20 members of the Senate actively sought positions on the Senate Indian Affairs Committee. And as you can imagine, things began proportionately to change even more. So November 21st, 1986 was the informal designation of Senator Inouye's new responsibility. And in January of 1987, he assumed the chairmanship of the Senate Indian Affairs Committee. A mere 6 to 7 weeks thereafter, one of the first hearings that the senator chaired was a hearing on a bill sponsored by Senator John Melcher of Montana. It was a bill that Senator Melcher had introduced in the prior session of the Congress and had reintroduced in the 100th session of the Congress. It was a bill on repatriation. The bill provided that one of our dear friends, Pablita Abeta, has just entered this room, and she was very much involved in the museum's formulation and came to work here at the museum. So I digressed for a moment. This hearing was, the bill provided that if Native American human remains, sacred objects, or culturally affiliated objects were found on federal lands, that those remains or cultural objects and artifacts would be returned to the family or tribe of origin, and if either were unknown, that the remains or cultural artifacts would be made available, access to those remains and cultural artifacts would be made available so that families and tribes of origins could repatriate the human remains of their ancestors. The Smithsonian Secretary came to testify at that hearing on February 20th, 1987. And in his testimony, the Secretary revealed that the Smithsonian was in possession of 18,500 human remains of Native Americans, American Indians, Alaska Natives, and Native Hawaiians. There was a deep shock amongst the audience. I think it was a very little known fact that the Smithsonian was in possession of these remains. And the senator, being a curious guy, asked, "How did you come into possession of these remains? And why do you still have them?" And the secretary proceeded to say that in the 1800s, the Surgeon General of the United States was conducting a medical study. He had a theory. The theory was that the larger one's skull was, the cranial capacity was greater, and thus, arguably, and this was the theory he wanted to test, was whether or not people with larger heads and larger brains were more intelligent and therefore more successful in many avenues of life. And so the Surgeon General sent out an order to the Army to gather remains and cultural artifacts that might be buried with those remains and send them back to the Army Medical Museum for study for this theory. And apparently the soldiers in the field took this order very seriously and not just gathered bodies that were found on battlefields, but in fact disinterred Native American remains and sent them back to the Army Medical Museum for medical study. After those studies were completed, the Army Medical Museum made those remains available to the Smithsonian. And so the Smithsonian had had them in their possession, relative time, but about 150 years. Why did they still have them? Because the Smithsonian was also conducting studies, not testing theories of that nature, but learning more about DNA, through DNA, learning more about the origins of the remains that they had in their possession, where those remains came from, and whether or not they could be culturally identified with a family or a tribe. Many were not. Many were not capable of being identified. And that was another reason they remained in the Smithsonian. Well, after that hearing, and as I said, there was deep shock in the audience, not the least of which was the shock and dismay of our brand new chairman. And he said, "We have to do something about this." Immediately after the hearing, he called the staff together and he said, "We are going to do two things. We are going to find a way to help the Smithsonian send back those remains, to empty their rooms and their little green boxes in which many Native American skulls were kept. We're going to find a way to help Smithsonian be relieved of this burden, but more importantly, we're going to find a way home for these people. And if we can't find a way home to their home of origin, we're going to build a memorial, and we're going to inter those human remains in that memorial. His idea was something like a tomb of the unknown soldier. This would be a tomb, a national memorial for American Indians who had found their way, sadly, to the Smithsonian Institution, with no derogation on the Smithsonian Institution. But that's what had transpired. That's what history did. So the senator set us about the finding out where a memorial could be situated. He was insistent that it be on the National Mall, because he said, after all, these lands on which our capital is sited and on which the business of this nation is carried forward, we are standing on, we are living in, we are working on Native American lands. And so it is only fitting and only right that this memorial be positioned on the National Mall in a central place where the Native American people can look at the U.S. Capitol and know that they have a place here. So we set about finding that out, and we learned that just a few years prior to that, the United States Congress, which used to decide where every single memorial or monument would be situated in the nation's capital, had decided, because of the overwhelming political pressure brought to bear for decisions on members of Congress for decisions of that nature, that the process was becoming too political. And so they decided to vest the National Park Service and the National Capital Planning Commission under the Park Service with the responsibility of determining where memorials and monuments would be situated on the National Mall. So we went about finding out the right people to meet with, and we did, and we brought them in. And one gentleman sat down with the senator and he said, "Senator, I know I've heard your plan. I think it's a glorious plan. But I have to tell you, there's only one site left on the National Mall, and that site has been reserved for the Smithsonian Institution, where the Smithsonian Institution wants to build a museum of man. There are plenty of places in Virginia," he said, "and some in Maryland. And so if you don't mind, we could work with you to build this memorial across the Potomac River in Virginia." And the senator said, "No, that won't do." The very same week of the hearing at which these revelations came forward, the senator received a phone call from a former member of Congress. His name is Barber Conable. He was a member of the board of the Museum of the American Indian High Foundation in New York. And he invited the senator up to come see the High collection, the collection of George Gustav High. There was a museum facility in New York and a storage facility in the Bronx. And so after several months, 2 months of planning, we went to the city of New York and we toured the High Foundation Museum, called the Museum of the American Indian High Foundation. And we met with the board of directors of the Museum of the American Indian High Foundation. And we toured the storage facility in which the bulk of the collection was held. George Gustav High was an avid collector, to say the least. He was someone who traveled around North, Central, and South America, and his fascination was with Native people. He would go into Native villages, and he would not just acquire things that you might see in a museum today. No, he bought or acquired, in whatever means possible, cooking implements, clothing, housing, teepees, everything in sight. He would buy whole villages if people agreed to relinquish them. And he brought them back to New York City, where he had an apartment. And he kept bringing things and bringing things and bringing things to his apartment until the stacks of his collection reached the ceilings. And at one point, his wife said to him, "George, it's either the collection or me." And he chose the collection. And so, in his quest to acquire all things Native, he acquired almost 1 million objects and artifacts from North, Central, and South America. And what we saw on that tour was everything you could imagine, everything that you've ever seen associated with Native people. And the storage facility was not in the best, to say the least, curatorial circumstances. There were hundreds of buffalo robes, beautiful buffalo robes, wrapped in plastic dry cleaning bags, where their future was bound to be one of deterioration. There were drawers and drawers of priceless objects, beautiful pottery, arrowheads. Well, literally everything that you could imagine. So on April 21st, 1987, 42 years to the day when the senator fought his last battle and had to leave the battlefield severely wounded, we met with the Board of Trustees of the Museum of the American Indian High Foundation, and we began to learn that although this museum had been sought after, indeed Ross Perot offered $50 million for the High Collection and the museum, he was turned down. But what the Board of Trustees told us was that seemingly, while the fight, whenever someone expressed interest in the High Collection, there were many in the city and state of New York who would rise to the challenge and say, no, this is our beloved collection. It belongs in New York. It cannot leave New York. As soon as the effort, the interest died down or was unsuccessful, no one cared about the museum anymore. And so the museum was woefully underfunded. The trustees did not know how in the world they were going to maintain this collection and save it from deterioration. And so they asked whether or not there was something the senator could help them with. The senator had invited Smithsonian Secretary Robert McCormick Adams to accompany us on this visit to the Museum of the American Indian. And Secretary Adams was quite impressed with the size and breadth and depth of the collection. And so he told the senator and he told the museum's Board of Trustees that the Smithsonian Institution would like to help them in their mission of saving this priceless collection. And then they came back to Washington. They had a plan. But one of the things that they wanted to know was what were the legal constraints, if any, on helping the Museum of the American Indian save the collection. And we learned that George Gustav High had a will. And one key provision of his will was that the collection must always have a presence, his collection must always have a presence in New York. And so ensued discussions with the city and state of New York as to how to address that provision of George Gustav High's will and still possibly take the collection to a place where it could be cared for in the proper fashion. And Secretary Adams suggested that that might be the Smithsonian Institution. And the senator asked the secretary, well, I thought you were going to build a museum of man. And the secretary said, maybe we can talk about having this museum be a museum of the native people of the United States. And there a plan was hatched. Discussions went underway with the city and state of New York, who, as they had in the past, mightily resisted any effort to take the collection out of New York. But when the question was put, how are you going to save it then if it stays in New York, no one had an answer. Past efforts to raise funds for the museum had not been successful. So the movement was toward the Smithsonian, but we still had the challenge of the New York siting. And in stepped Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan of New York, who was then serving as the chairman of the Committee on Environment and Public Works in the Senate. That committee has jurisdiction over all federal buildings. And Senator Moynihan said, Danny, I think I have a solution. There's an old building, the old United States Custom House, where people coming into the United States were processed before they could enter the main part of the United States. And this is a beautiful Art Deco building, and we are refurbishing it and going to use the upper floors of this building to house federal court judges. But the main floors, which are absolutely beautiful, have as yet no designated purpose. And so we believe that, I believe, Senator Moynihan said, that perhaps we could talk about using these floors, these main beautiful entry floors in the old United States Custom House at 1 Bowling Green as a potential site for the New York facility. That set the city and state of New York sort of back on their institutional feet and got negotiations going, restarted in a very vigorous way. There was still opposition, strong opposition to seeing the collection leave New York. And the city and the state, their attorneys, the Attorney General of the state of New York were very much involved in making the arguments as to why the collection should not leave, notwithstanding the fact that there could be a New York presence. So there were many, many meetings in New York mostly, some in Washington, between the Smithsonian and the city and state of New York, and really things were not going very well, not going swimmingly. Senator Inouye sat in on every meeting. But there were large institutional egos, and it appeared at times grim that this grand idea could ever come into fruition. And then up stepped David Rockefeller. And David Rockefeller said to Senator Inouye, "Danny, if you want me to be of help, I will do everything I can to make this happen. Because I've studied a lot of Native American history, and I believe that the ancestors are calling upon us, and it is our sacred duty to see that the remains are returned and that this collection is given to the American people so that all may know what the grand contributions of Native people have been to the fabric of our society." And when David Rockefeller stepped in his quiet, gentle, but very forceful way, he never banged ahead, but he got people talking. He got them talking in a friendly way. He got them talking in a way not as opponents, but as people who were going to work together to make this happen. And ultimately, an agreement was reached between the Smithsonian and the city and the state of New York. And the Smithsonian agreed to bring the High Collection to Washington, to maintain a facility in New York, to also house the High Collection. And in discussions with the senator, Smithsonian agreed to have the one site left on the National Mall that had been reserved for the use of the Smithsonian to be designated as the site of a museum for housing the High Collection. Very shortly thereafter, legislation was introduced in the Senate to establish a National Museum of the American Indian and memorial, because that was still very much in the center of the senator's mind. The legislation anticipated that 3 sites would be established: the New York facility, a museum on the National Mall, and a storage facility now known as the National Museum of the American Indians Cultural Resource Center, where the bulk of the collection could be housed and curated in a proper fashion. You might think this was a smooth path then. We had agreement from those most difficult to bring to agreement. But then when we started talking about legislation, it turned into a negotiation between the Senate and the Smithsonian Institution. And the Smithsonian Institution was very opposed to having a museum also be a memorial to Native Americans. And the position was that it was inappropriate to have anyone interred, any memorial for the interment of human remains on the National Mall. And I remember we were leaving one particularly difficult meeting with the Smithsonian, and we walked out. This is the Castle building, for those of you who are familiar with the Smithsonian Institution and where its main offices are housed in the Castle building. And as we were leaving, there was a room off to the right, and the senator asked the woman who was escorting us, "What is that?" And he started walking to the room, and this lady said, "Senator, I don't think you need to see that room." And he said, "Why not?" "Oh, you need to get on your way." And he said, "No," his curiosity was once again piqued. He said, "No, I really would like to see that room." And it turned out that the room was a sarcophagus holding the body of John Smithson. And the senator said, "Oh, but I thought you were opposed to having any memorial or any remains on the National Mall." As you can imagine, things changed dramatically after that. And discussions ensued with the Smithsonian, but we still had one more issue, and that was that in all of the Smithsonian museums up until that time, there was no legislation that designated, because the Smithsonian was opposed to it, that would designate who would sit on the board of trustees of any of the museum facilities. In this instance, there was one person in the United States Senate who was absolutely intransigent, absolutely adamant, that if there was going to be a museum established, a National Museum of the American Indian, it sure as heck ought to have Native Americans on its board of trustees. And it sure as heck ought to have a majority of the members of the board of trustees be of Native American ancestry. And that was not a pleasant exchange. In any event, hearings were held in the joint capacity of the Senate Rules Committee and the Senate Indian Affairs Committee. Testimony from Indian countries strongly advocated that in addition to repatriation, general repatriation legislation that was being developed in the Congress, that there ought to be specific repatriation provisions for the National Museum of the American Indian. At the same time, Congressman Ben Nighthorse Campbell introduced a companion bill in the House of Representatives. And so he joined Senator Inouye as the two major advocates, principal advocates for the passage of this legislation. Ultimately, an agreement was signed amongst the city and state of New York and the Smithsonian on the terrace of the Smithsonian's Air and Space Museum. Negotiations over repatriation provisions of the legislation ensued, including a requirement for the inventory of Native American human remains to be conducted by the Smithsonian of the remains that were in their possession. More hearings were held. Legislation was passed in both houses of the Congress, but we still had the White House to contend with. And it wasn't certain that the White House was in favor of establishing a National Museum of the American Indian with so many competing demands on the White House. But once again, David Rockefeller interceded. He went to see the president, and he urged him in the strongest possible terms to sign this legislation into law. And so, 2 years and 6 months after that initial meeting in New York with the Museum of the American Indian High Foundation Board of Trustees, the president signed into law Public Law 101-185, which established the National Museum of the American Indian and also provided authorization for tribal museums to affiliate with the National Museum of the American Indian. The senator had a vision for the National Museum of the American Indian. He was someone who believed deeply and fervently in education. And he said, if people understand the kinds of things that I've learned in the last 2 years, and I knew almost nothing about Indian country, they need to learn what I've learned. They need to know how vast and deep and broad the contributions of Native people are to the fabric of our society, and everything that this nation is today, we owe to the Native people. And so I want to see this museum be a place where non-Native people can come and learn about Indian country and Alaska Natives and Native Hawaiians and all that they've done, not just historically, but presently, today and into the future. And by the same token, I want young Indian people to come to this museum so they can learn about their parents and their grandparents and their great-grandparents and what great leaders they were, and the fact that our nation was founded on the principles of the 7 nations of the Iroquois Confederacy and the principles of the democratic principles of the Iroquois Confederacy. And that's what he wanted this museum to be, a tool of education for Indians and non-Indians, young and old. And we talked about, over the course of those 2 years, that this grand vision would one day become a reality, and that many years afterward, maybe decades after the establishment of the museum, it would have a cumulative impact that would be great. Never did we anticipate that on the day the museum opened on September 21st, 1994, that there would be a procession of thousands of people from North, Central, and South America, native people, many dressed in their native garb and traditional wear, would proceed from the Washington Monument and walk the length of the National Mall to the site of this museum. Thousands and thousands of people. And so, from day one, this museum has been everything it was hoped to be, and so very much more. It is a home for Native people from all across the country. When they come here to Washington, this is the place that is the gathering place, the welcoming place, and the place that is not overloaded with politics. This is the place where we come to respect the core values that Regis Pecos was talking about earlier. This is the place where we have the time, the quiet, to think about what we want our children, what we want for our children, what we want for our grandchildren, and how this museum can play a role in shaping their future.